G'day everybody, my name's Tim and I'm excited to be able to share with you a bit tonight from that passage of Jonah and a little bit about, some of my own experience with sharing with other people as well in doing missions or just evangelism, expressing your faith, however that works out. And I think Jonah is a great example. The story of Jonah teaches us a lot of different things about how that works out, but often that's not so much what we think of necessarily when we think of the story of Jonah. Sometimes I work at a school as a chaplain, and when I talk to people about the story of Jonah, usually what comes to mind is the big fish or the idea that, there's nowhere that you can go that's far enough away that you can hide from God or anything like that. But I think one of the most important things about the story of Jonah is the way that it teaches us about how God reaches out to the people that we might least expect him to be interested in. There's this idea that kind of can get into our heads easily that God is really only ever interested in the Jews up until Jesus, and then suddenly everything changes. But and we get this idea that there's a big difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and particularly when it comes to mission and evangelism and God's character as expressed in Jesus, and that when the Holy Spirit pops up, then everything really changes. But it's something that you can see God's heart for the whole world coming through in the Old Testament as well, particularly in the story of Jonah. And that he instructs Jonah, he's like, go and preach to these people basically about how wicked they are, is what it says, is go and tell them how much they've done wrong, is kind of God's instruction to Jonah. And there are a few key bits to understand on why it's kind of a big deal that Jonah is going to Nineveh, to the Assyrians. Because the Assyrians are basically like enemies, like really bad enemies of the Jewish people who Jonah was a part of. And they have this empire and they would like to add Israel into that empire, and they do end up taking over a large part of their land. And so this might be a big deal for Jonah when he thinks of who the Ninevites are, what they represent, how he relates to them is probably mostly enemies. But this idea that God would reach out to not only far away places, but even the people that want nothing to do with the way of the Jews or Israel is something that even comes through in the temple, right? In that when the Jewish people in Jerusalem built this big building that was going to be central in the worship of God, here is one of the things that was, I think, a part of Solomon's prayer right at the beginning of the temple. This is from 2 Chronicles 6, describing the dedication of the temple in his prayer to God. Moreover, concerning a foreigner who is not of your people Israel, but has come from a far country, for the sake of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm, when they come and pray in this temple, then hear from heaven your dwelling place and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, that all peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, that they may know that this temple which I have built is called by your name. So even something that seems really specific to who the Jews are and how they worship God was meant to be something that all the nations could come to and use. And this helps us fill in the blank of what seems like a weird moment in Jesus' ministry as well, when he rocks up into the temple with a whip and drives people out. Seems like a bit of an outlier for a lot of the way that Jesus acts in other parts of the Gospels. But thinking about how the temple was being treated in excluding people who weren't Jews, particularly from the places that they were allowed. It says in Mark 11, when Jesus is asked to describe his reasoning, he says, "My house will be called a house of prayer for the nations." but you have made it a den of robbers. And the place where they set up all their stalls to essentially make money, was in the place where the other nations were allowed in. And it was all blocked up with all these stalls. And so Jesus is like, this is supposed to be a place of prayer. This is where they're actually allowed in. And you are hindering that. That's why he's so upset. And Jesus consistently stands up for those who the self-righteous would cast out, who would be excluded otherwise. And he brings them in. He's accused of eating with and drinking with the worst kinds of people. And his reasoning for that is, well, don't doctors go to the sick? Aren't they the ones who need healing? He walks through a crowd and he goes straight towards the guy who everyone hates and who is cheating everybody else out of their money, Zacchaeus, who's climbed up a tree, and he publicly honors him and says, I'm going to go and stay with you. He goes and spends days with the Samaritans, who the Jewish people really didn't get along with, to teach them. And he talks about it in terms of the lost sheep. The one that leaves the 100 is the one that he will go after, because the Son of Man came to seek and save what is lost. And it's the same kind of thing happening in the story of Jonah, particularly the part that we heard just before. What is Jonah's response, though, to this revealing of God trying to reach others, in that he really doesn't want to, in that he boards the ship going in the opposite direction? He really doesn't want to do it. And I don't think, even though these guys are their enemies and they end up conquering a fair bit of his country, I don't think that it has much to do with fear of what these enemies might do to him, because later on in the boat, he doesn't seem to be particularly afraid of dying. Right? In that he's asleep in the boat and they're like, oh, everything's going on, don't you care? It doesn't really seem like he cares that much. I don't think it has too much with fearing these sailors either, who are praying to a whole heap of different gods. I think it comes from Jonah just really hating the people of Nineveh. And he essentially, even when you'll find out, because I think you're continuing to go through Jonah, you find out Jonah's response when he does end up preaching at Nineveh. He basically does the bare minimum and then finds a good spot where he hopes he's going to watch God destroy them. And then is really upset when God doesn't destroy them. But this kind of attitude gives us a bit of insight into what it means to judge. When the Bible talks about judgment in not judging, that is from our part in not judging. Jonah has made a call and he thinks that they deserve to be wiped out. And he's decided that they don't deserve a chance to be reached by God. And God said, this is going to be your responsibility. He says, I don't think that they deserve what you're going to give them in this chance. And it's important, I think, to separate between what discernment is and what judgment is as well. In that you can look at something and say, well, that's wrong. And that doesn't mean that it is judgment. That's being able to decide between right and wrong. But when you make a call on someone's worth or what they deserve because of what you've seen as right and wrong, then you're passing into judgment. In the same way that a judge might determine, this is what this person deserves. Okay, we've seen right or wrong, and now this is what needs to happen to them. But as far as a matter of right and wrong goes, judgment is not our job. That's not for us to engage in. This is a verse from James 4:11. It says, brothers and sisters, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against a brother or sister or judges them speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you are not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbor? So it doesn't mean that wrongdoing or sin is something that we become silent or cannot talk about. Recognizing sin is not judgment. It's the condemnation that goes along with that we are to have no part in. That's not our role. And I think that's why it's lumped in with slander in that verse. And it says, don't, tear people down in your words when you speak to each other about them. And notice the fact that Jonah is sent because they're doing the wrong thing. There's no discernment necessary. God said, hey, I know they've done the wrong thing, and here's what they deserve. They deserve to hear about me, is ultimately what happens. God is the judge and is choosing mercy, and Jonah does not like that. And judgment blinds us. And here, Jonah provides another good example. This is from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. In the same way that you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First, take the plank out of your own eye, and you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Now, this is, I think, important for us to make sense of some of what that means, is in the story of Jonah. In that, here is Jonah thinking about the people of Nineveh, in that these guys don't listen to God or live by his ways at all. They ignore him. They don't do what he wants. So why should I go and tell them? But in that very moment that Jonah is saying, I'm not going to go and tell them, he is doing exactly the same thing. He is saying to God, I'm not going to listen to you or follow your ways. I'm going to go off and do my own thing. And you have the very picture of having a plank in your own eye blinding you to helping somebody else with their problem. And it comes down to our own self-righteousness when we get into that place of judgment. So, what happens next in the story? In that Jonah hops on the boat and God sends a storm. And as I was talking about before, these sailors follow other gods. It says that they begin to cry out to all of their other gods, and they pray and nothing happens, and they try saving the ship, and that doesn't work, and they find out that it's Jonah. And even after they find out that Jonah is at fault, they still try to save themselves and fix things. And eventually Jonah says, all right, if you throw me overboard, then everything will be okay. And so what does that cause the sailors to do? It causes them to pray for forgiveness to God. Which is a really strange thing in that, wow, God must really not like this guy, and that's why everything's happening. Please forgive us for what we're about to do. And they throw him over, and everything stops. And then something even more amazing happens in that they start to acknowledge and worship God. And it says, I only noticed it when you were doing the reading this time, they make vows. They're very affected, by what has just happened. And his actions in Jonah trying to run away from people that he's supposed to be preaching to ends up reaching these sailors. And I think this is a really important thing for us to remember when we think about how we are a part of God reaching out to other people. And we can be so afraid of failure that we never do it. We think about what could happen and all the ways that it could go wrong. And so we don't engage. And Jonah is a great example of failure here, in its failure to the point of non-compliance, in that God's been like, Jonah, you need to do this. And he said no. So that's the worst kind, is not even attempting and doing the opposite thing. And I think I often come from that standpoint as well, in that I really struggle a lot of the time to just start to engage. And then an opportunity comes up, or even the thought of wanting to put myself in places where the opportunity might arise to reach someone else who might be far from God. That can be a real struggle. in thinking, oh, what could happen, what could go wrong. But I think we should be relieved in stories like Jonah, because even in a case of complete failure, God is using that to make a real difference. And the same idea is at the heart of a lot of what God does and shows us through the Bible. And it's at the heart of what we believe as followers of Jesus as well, is that we don't have enough, is that we are ultimately failures, and we have to trust on what he gives us for the basics to work. And that extends into how we follow in reaching out as a part of what God's doing as well. We own up and we live into that idea that we don't have what it takes in every way. And things often don't go well, but it pleases God to use weakness to display the greatness of his redemptive power. And a couple of examples here, so this makes more sense. The glaringly obvious one is the cross. How did God go about reconciling the world back to himself? Through God coming to the world as an infant, like as a baby, and growing up in a conquered nation and making friends with social outcasts, and then just as things were starting to work, getting tortured to death. That would seem like everyone a massive failure. And even to his followers who spent years talking to about this. And it comes through in Matthew 16. Peter confesses him as the Christ. And then Jesus starts letting him into the rest of the plan. So this is from chapter 16, verse 21. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. And this is exactly what happened, in that it does sound like a really bad plan. Like in that Peter's like, I know that you're the one who's been sent from God. And he's like, I am, and here's the plan. I'm going to go and be put on trial and killed. And Peter's like, that's not a plan. It's not a good plan. Let's not do that. But this is how God works. That is exactly what happened, and that is the pinnacle of God reaching everyone in Jesus' work, in his death and resurrection. And so to show that this isn't a Jesus thing, it's an Old Testament thing, right back in Genesis. The story of Joseph is a perfect example in that he starts off with this dream. He's going to be his brothers and family, and everyone's going to bow down to him. And this is who he's going to be. And then his brothers fake his death and sell him as a slave. And then he's framed as a slave and put in prison. And then from prison, he's forgotten by the guy that could possibly help him out. And this is like a year's kind of process. This is a long thing. But then overnight, he becomes the most powerful guy around. And it's only because of that process that he's able to save his family and a ton of other people from dying in a famine. This is going from a favorite son to a prisoner is not looking like these dreams that he had of who he was going to be and what he was going to do would be fulfilled. But in fact, it's the very thing that made them fulfilled. God uses those things to bring about his promise. Or then again, after Jesus, so in Acts, a great example is Paul and Silas, in that they go out and they're very deliberately sharing their faith and telling everyone about Jesus. And there's this girl who they basically free from being like a human crystal ball. It's like Acts 16 if you want to check it out. But she's being used to tell the future, and people are making a lot of money off of her. And they free her from that. And then the guys who own this girl who's a slave at the time get really mad because they're losing money. And so they stir up the town. And so Paul and Silas are there and they end up getting arrested even though they haven't really done anything wrong. And they get beaten publicly and stripped and then put in prison. And that is not a successful, they wouldn't have planned that. That doesn't look like success, being in prison in the middle of the night after being beaten. But that is exactly what God uses. In that it's that night that there's a crazy earthquake and then all the chains come off and the jailer and his entire family are able to receive God. And so it is this is the way that God works consistently through the Bible. And in my own experience as well, I led a trip once to Myanmar, and my wife led a trip in that same period to the Navajo Nation in America. And one of the key leaders on her team tore his Achilles tendon like 2 days before the trip was about to go out. And he wrote her a letter. And this letter proved not only really important to her experience of everything going haywire right at the end, but also a lot to my experience in Myanmar. He quoted this poem to her: "Disappointment, his appointment. Change one letter, then I see that the thwarting of my purpose is God's better choice for me." So she goes off on this trip, and it's been really disrupted in going. And I've gone on this other trip, and I remember getting there. We're working with some missionaries, and I wanted to ensure that I was helpful in what we were doing there. So I spoke to the missionaries, and I was like, hey, what is the most important thing that we can do for you? We don't want to just be doing our own thing around here. What is it that you think God is doing? How can we be a part of that? And she talked about reaching the kids that were a part of the children's home that they were running. And considering the language gap and everything like that, I was like, this is going to be a really difficult thing to do. I don't know how I'm going to do this. Part of our project was building this dormitory and / church building. And it didn't go very well, in that there were loads of power outages and supply issues, and in the end, if we were going to finish, we had to pull an all-nighter on one of our last nights to get this thing done. And so we're up at probably about 11 p.m. trying to work on this thing, and we've all got head torches on, trying to finish off what we were doing. And so we managed to get it done, and then the next day we have a farewell with everyone, and one of the missionaries gets up and she's crying, and she's like, so last night as you were working on the building, the kids saw what you were doing, and they're like, what are they doing up in the middle of the night working? And she explained that we were building this home for them, and she's like, it was then that they knew that the love that you've experienced and that you have for them was real. And that's what they want to go and share to their villages when they leave here. And so, what was one of the most stressful experiences of my life, running this team, was exactly what God was using to accomplish his purpose. And it's a really, that can be incredibly relieving when we feel like we're failing, because we fail a lot. That is what God uses in his kingdom. Read it to you again. Disappointment, his appointment. Change one letter, then I see that the thwarting of my purpose is God's better choice for me. So I hope that knowing some of this, and Jonah being a bit of an example in a good way of failing, is encouraging and relieving for you when you consider how you go about living your life of faith and how that is opened up to others. Because it makes you feel vulnerable, but it's that vulnerability and weakness that is a part of God's chosen method. I'm going to finish off with some prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you that you work in our weaknesses, and you use those failures, that they aren't meaningless, and that the difficulty has purpose. And Lord, I ask that as you prompt us to go about in your work, that you would continue to remind us of this and bring us comfort, and that you would cause us to be bold in doing so. Lord, we thank you for all that you do in our lives, and ask that you would continue to use us. In Jesus' name, amen.